The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to the host who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord. In our first passage from the Old Testament wisdom book of Sirach, we read, "Conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved more than the giver of gifts. Humble yourself the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God." The virtue of humility is the key to holiness. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the great spiritual writer of the Middle Ages, said, "Humility is the mother of salvation." Christ is the model of humility. He came to do his Father's will, not his own. He came to serve, not be served. As St. Paul writes, and we even hear this referenced in our second passage, Jesus entered this world. He emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. He humbled himself, obediently accepting even death on the cross. So humility is essential to our growth to reflect that image of God in which we are created, and specifically that image of Christ. Now, my brothers and sisters, the problem is we're the poor victims of original sin. We all are wounded with concupiscence. Therefore, we struggle with pride. Now, I don't mean pride in the good sense, like we've accomplished something, we feel good about it. Rightfully so. We should. Or we have some other success in life, or a good sense of self-esteem. That's perfectly right. But we accept all of that with humility. What I'm speaking of here, this pride, is the first of the 7 capital sins. It's the primary sin. It's the pride in the sense of we have an inordinate, an exaggerated self-esteem. We think of ourselves better than everyone else. In a sense, we even sort of make ourselves like a god. It's all about me. It's all about my kingdom. I deserve this and that. Think of our gospel. Jesus noticed all these people sort of maneuvering for that place of honor. Well, imagine what goes on Capitol Hill. Who gets to sit next to the Speaker of the House or something, or at the White House, who maneuvers to get close to the President, or even at the Vatican, and so on. I remember my dear friend Bishop Curlin and I were talking, and I asked him once, when we have these big processions of all these bishops, How do you know where to stand? What order? He said, oh, they all know what order they fall into, from the lowest to the highest. Oh, yes, indeed. Oh, yes, we all have to be careful. So in a way, there's this tension going on in our life, and we have to therefore strive for that virtue of humility. Humility recognizes that God is God. He's the primary priority, number one. God gave us everything, and we're called to be those humble servants. So a humble person, makes the time for prayer. Humble person makes the time for Sunday Mass. He makes time throughout the day to make little acts of praise or thanksgiving, petition, even contrition. He's always mindful of God, who's the giver of all good gifts. Now, this isn't simply about cranking out duties, it's about love, that we love God. And therefore, as that humble servant in love, we show that love. The pride-filled person, though, the prideful person, really thinks, well, something else is the number one priority. If I can, I'll make some time for God. I'll maybe make some time for prayer. If Mass is convenient, I'll make time for Mass, and so on. It's sort of like God owes me something. I don't remember, but I remember reading that King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who built Versailles, once had this battle, his army against the British army, and his army was defeated miserably. And King Louis said to his personal chaplain, "Does not God realize everything I have done for him?" Oh, that is pride. A humble person, too, is one who is going to recognize his accomplishments, graciously accept compliments, and so on, but gives thanks, because all of our talents, our abilities, are gifts from God to be used wisely. Our accomplishments are good, but we should give thanks to God and thanks to those who've helped us. We didn't do it on our own. We had parents, teachers, coaches, others who've helped us along the way. The grateful person will also compliment those who have done well, or even compliment those who have done better. Whereas the prideful person thinks it's all about me. I did this. Forgets to say thank you. The prideful person will have envy towards those who do better, or mocks those who do worse. Continuing on, the humble person is going to, as Sirach said, conduct all affairs with humility, meaning he is there to do his best in the eyes of God, to do what God thinks is good, and therefore to do his best in regards to others, whether it's at school, business, family life, whatever, to do his best to serve those. Such a good, humble servant, too, is always going to give. Think about giving to help someone who may be in need. Our Lord mentions at the banquet, not just inviting those who you think might repay you back, but inviting the poor. So this humble person will be mindful of maybe the elderly relative or the elderly neighbor who's alone. I've known families in this parish who have taken in elderly relatives to care for them even till death. I've known people who invite an elderly neighbor who is alone over for Christmas dinner, Easter dinner, things like that, so that that person feels loved. So the grateful person is always wanting to do what is right, even on that personal level. So in engaging with other people, a humble person respects the dignity of each person, is courteous. A humble person will listen. And even though a person may disagree, so be it. A humble person can say, "We agree to disagree." The prideful person is much different. The prideful person is the one who looks out after numero uno, number one, always how this will benefit me. If the prideful person gives, it's because it is convenient. Not sacrificial, convenience. He may give a lot, but it's all done out of convenience. The prideful person who disagrees is also the one who will then mock, vilify, demonize the opponent. Oh, don't we see that in this world today? So, the prideful person versus the humble. We could go on. And the humble person is the one who will admit a mistake, take responsibility, ask for forgiveness. The humble person also does forgive and accepts the apology, whereas the prideful person will always blame somebody else, somehow deflect responsibility for the mistake. The prideful person may demand the apology, but will not give the apology. The prideful person also is going to be the one who holds on to that grudge, never letting the person forget the mistake that has been made. Humility versus pride. But then, too, the humble person can laugh at himself. How important that is, especially in our world today, to laugh at the circumstances of life and laugh at oneself. I remember way back, Pope St. John Paul II was once visiting a nursing home in Rome. And he's visiting the elderly residents there. And he saw this one little lady who was in a wheelchair, sort of all by herself. And so the Pope went up to her, and with that nice little twinkle in his eye, he said, "Do you know who I am?" And she said, "No, but if you ask the nurse, she can tell you." Okay? And then I have a priest friend. He was a few years ahead of me in the seminary, but he was in a little town in Pennsylvania. He had a car accident, so he was taken to one of these emergency care centers. That's all they had. But they realized he needed more treatment at the hospital 30 miles away. The problem, they didn't have an ambulance. So they used the hearse from the funeral home. So they put him in the hearse, and he said, "Well, either way, I'm going to the right place," you know. And you have to look at life this way. And then I remember back at my other parish, I was teaching the second graders. It was about the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and I'm doing my very erudite lecture. These poor little second graders have their big, wide eyes, you know, like the deer in the headlights kind of thing. So at the end, I said, "Are there any questions?" And this one little girl. So I said, "Yes, Victoria." She then pointed at my Roman collar and said, "How do you get your head through that thing?" I thought, well, so much for high theology, you know. So, you know, we have to laugh at ourselves. But think how people get so offended these days. Oh, they get so offended over everything. Again, going back to President Bush the First, once he just made a statement, "I don't like broccoli." Well, the Broccoli Growers Association demanded an apology. How could he say that about broccoli? And he said, "I don't like broccoli. I've never liked broccoli. You can ask Barbara, my wife. I don't like broccoli. And I'm the president. I don't have to eat broccoli." You know, no. But you look at our world today and you think, we have slipped into this prideful mentality. We need a good dose of humility. Humility helps us live that image of God and that image of Christ. Humility helps us grow in holiness. This prideful disposition sets us up for the fall. The book of Proverbs of the Old Testament says, "Pride goes before disaster, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Now, we've had some laughs, but we really do need to take this seriously. Last weekend, I was given the Wall Street Journal, and there was an article written by a psychiatrist and a psychologist about the problems affecting our young people when they go to college. The problem is we've set them up for disaster in many ways because we've pumped up this prideful sense instead of pumping up the humble sense. For instance, they talked about how there's this growing rate of things like anxiety, crippling anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, eating disorders, incidents of self-harm. They said 85% of college students described feeling overwhelmed. 51% reported feeling at some point that things were hopeless. That's sad. Now they go on and they say, well, it's partly due because of so many broken homes these days, but then also the recession, the joblessness, employment, things like that. Also, the social media has caused a big problem in this area. But they also noted parents. And this is something for parents to take to heart. And I'll just read this. It said, American parents have moved away from the traditional emphasis on encouraging childhood independence, seeking instead to exert ever more control over their children's lives. The pitfalls of this approach include over-preparation, which can place academic achievement at the center of a child's self-esteem. Overprotection, which keeps children from making their own mistakes and learning from them. And overinvestment, when parents try to meet their own needs by pushing a child forward in their image. The point is, we have to be careful that we don't create like these little gods filled with pride, that think they can do no wrong, that think that they are owed, that somehow everything will be taken care of, that they don't have to take responsibility. For instance, I was talking to Father Sly. You probably remember him from 4 years ago. He's now head of a high school in Kansas City, Missouri. He was telling me how the student was caught vandalizing. So called the student in, called his father in. And the father said, I don't believe this. My son would never do such a thing. So Father Sly said, well, let me show you the videotape. So there they have it. The kid is shown vandalizing the school. And the father said, I choose to believe my son. What is that saying to the son? Or I know a young person who used to umpire Little League Baseball. He is just a high school kid wanting to make some money. He stopped because of how the parents were throwing profanities and even physical threats against him. A college professor of mine who teaches at Marymount said it's not uncommon anymore for a parent to call up about a student's grade. And these kids are supposed to be in college. So my brothers and sisters, what we need as a society is a good dose of humility. We look at the problems, it's because we've given ourselves over to this prideful spirit. Keep in mind what Jesus said, that in the end, those who are exalted will be humbled, those humbled will be exalted. But we keep in mind, too, what the Lord said to the prophet Micah. You have been told, O man, which is good, and what the Lord requires of you. Only do the right, and to love goodness, and to walk humbly with your God. If we do that, we'll find our place at the heavenly banquet. May God bless you.